In the small rural town of San Roque, nestled in the rugged hills of the southwestern desert, life had always been quiet, predictable. Farmers worked the land, cattle grazed in open fields, and the most excitement anyone had was the annual harvest festival. The people of San Roque were simple folk, but they took pride in their way of life. That was until the summer of 1999, when the killings began. It started slowly at first. A few goats found dead at the edge of town, their bodies drained of blood, puncture wounds on their necks. At first, the townsfolk blamed coyotes or wild dogs, though they couldn't explain the lack of blood or the precise bite marks. But as the bodies piled up, cattle, sheep, even horses, the sense of dread in the town grew. The killings weren't random. Each night a new farmer would wake to find his animals slaughtered, left untouched apart from the eerie absence of blood. Then the rumors started. The old-timers whispered about the Chupacabra, the legendary creature said to drain the blood of livestock. No one had ever seen it, but everyone knew the stories. The fear spread like wildfire through San Roque, turning the quiet rural town into a place filled with suspicion, fear, and nightly patrols. Carlos Hernandez was the first to claim he'd seen the creature. It was late one night as he was out checking on his cattle. His flashlight had flickered in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the field. That's when he saw it, something moving low to the ground, hunched, its eyes glowing an unnatural red in the beam of his light. He swore it was no coyote. Its body was covered in coarse, matted fur, and it moved with a strange, jerky gait. Carlos fired his shotgun, but the creature was too fast. It darted into the brush, vanishing into the desert night, leaving behind nothing but the eerie silence of the still, starlit sky. Word spread quickly. The Chupacabra was real. Panic gripped the town, and soon no one dared to go out at night. Farmers began locking their animals in barns, setting traps and forming nightly patrols. But the killings continued. Father Miguel, the town's priest, called a meeting at the church after Mass one Sunday. The townspeople filled the wooden pews, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. "We cannot live like this," Father Miguel said, his voice echoing in the stone-walled chapel. "This creature, this Chupacabra, has cursed our town. We must confront it before it destroys everything we hold dear." The townspeople nodded in agreement, though fear was still etched in their faces. Carlos stood up, his rough hands trembling. "We need to hunt it," he said. "No more hiding, no more waiting for it to come to us. We go out there and we find it, we kill it." There was a murmur of agreement. The men of the town gathered their rifles and shotguns, preparing for what they knew would be the most dangerous hunt of their lives. The men left the town just as the sun began to set, casting an ominous red glow over the desert. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant caw of a crow. Armed with flashlights, rifles, and crosses, the men spread out across the hills, scanning the darkening horizon for any sign of the creature. For hours they searched in vain, the vast desert stretching endlessly around them. The deeper into the wilderness they went, the more oppressive the silence became. Even the nocturnal creatures seemed to sense the danger lurking in the shadows. It wasn't until midnight that the first scream rang out. Carlos had ventured ahead, his flashlight casting weak beams across the rocky terrain. He had bent down to inspect what looked like fresh tracks, three-toed, clawed, unlike any animal he'd ever seen, when something leapt from the darkness. The creature was fast, too fast to react. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The other men heard his scream and rushed toward the sound, but by the time they arrived, Carlos was gone. Blood stained the dirt where he'd fallen, but there was no sign of his body. Panic spread through the group. Some wanted to go back to retreat to the safety of the town, but Father Miguel stood firm. "We can't leave now," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes were filled with fear. "It's close, we have to stop it." Suddenly there was a rustling in the nearby bushes. All flashlights turned toward the sound. The men could hear the ragged breathing of something just beyond the light, and then it emerged, the Chupacabra. It was worse than they had imagined. The creature was small but terrifying, a twisted mockery of an animal. It stood on two hind legs, though it hunched forward as if ready to pounce. Its eyes glowed red, and its skin was leathery, covered in patches of wiry fur. Long, needle-like teeth protruded from its open mouth, and its claws clicked against the rocky ground. Its appearance was otherworldly, a nightmare come to life. For a moment, everyone stood frozen, too terrified to move. Then Father Miguel raised his cross, shouting a prayer to drive the creature away. The Chupacabra let out an ear-piercing screech, and the men opened fire. Bullets tore through the night, but the creature was fast, dodging, weaving, until it lunged at one of the hunters. It sank its teeth into the man's neck, blood spurting as he screamed and collapsed. The creature turned, blood dripping from its mouth, and darted back into the brush. In the chaos, the group fell apart. Some men ran, dropping their weapons as they fled back to town. Others, like Father Miguel, stood frozen, unable to comprehend the horror they had just witnessed. The hunt had failed. By the time they returned to San Roque, it was well past dawn. The town was eerily silent. Carlos was dead, and the creature was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting for its next victim. That night, no one slept. The fear had become unbearable. The next night, Father Miguel decided it had to end. He knew that the Chupacabra would return to feed, to continue its terror. He gathered what few brave souls remained and led them into the hills, determined to confront the creature one last time. As they reached the site of the previous night's attack, the air grew colder, the wind more fierce. They set up a trap, laying out an animal carcass in the open to draw the beast. Hours passed, the men waiting in tense silence, until finally they heard it, the sound of claws scraping against stone. The creature appeared, eyes glowing in the darkness, drawn to the blood. But this time the men were ready. They surrounded it, firing off rounds as the creature hissed and snarled. Father Miguel stood at the center of the group, holding his cross high as he shouted prayers into the night. The Chupacabra screeched, lunging at him. But this time it didn't escape the hail of bullets. The creature collapsed to the ground, writhing as blood pooled around it. Its body twitched, then fell still. The men gathered around the fallen beast, staring in disbelief. The nightmare was over. The town of San Roque returned to a semblance of normalcy in the weeks that followed. The livestock killings stopped, and the people slowly began to forget the terror that had gripped them. But Father Miguel knew better. As he buried Carlos in the churchyard, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Chupacabra wasn't alone. Somewhere out in the hills, the creature's kin were waiting, biding their time. He prayed for the town every night, knowing that one day the Chupacabra might return, and when it did, he hoped they would be ready.